أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah, we have reached our 20th juz of the reminders, and inshallah I hope you've been listening to our previous contributors and taking benefit from it. As with the 20th juz also reminds us, we almost have finished 20 fasts, or 19, which means we're also moving into the last ashara, which is very important. Surah in the 20th juz, I am just going to very briefly look at Surah Al-Qasas, which is the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. The surah is pertinent actually because it is just revealed to the Prophet, peace be upon him, just before his night journey into the heavens. So clearly a way to explain to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and to spiritually enlighten him how the previous prophets actually lived and the tests that they were faced with. Surah Al-Qasas highlights this beautiful story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. And it's a very famous story in which the famous Pharaoh, or Ramses II, had been told by his scholars that someone was going to be born who's going to overthrow his rule. So he decided then to kill off the sons in each year and let them live 1 year. And the surah really talks about that. So the year when Musa alayhi salam is born was a year which, they were meant to actually die. Musa alayhi salam actually Musa alayhi salam's mother puts him into a basket and then kind of pushes him away. And the Quran talks about it. It says that فَالْتَقَطَهُ آلُ فِرْعَوْنَ لِيَكُونَ لَهُمْ عَدُوًّا وَحَزَنًا إِنَّ فِرْعَوْنَ وَهَامَنَ وَجُنُودَهُمَا كَانُوا خَاطِئِينَ. That Musa alayhi salam, who eventually lands up in the palace of Fir'aun, he is being brought up in the very same place that he's going to perhaps turn upside down and destroy, Pharaoh's house essentially, and the kind of idolatry that the Pharaoh was engaged with and how he considered himself actually to be God. And the surah, the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam has a couple of interesting factors. One is that Musa alayhi salam is born in a palace, raised up in the palace, but then he is pushed away and becomes a shepherd. And he knows the place very well, actually, where he's actually going to preach. And this is very important for us, that we understand the nature of people before we actually engage with them. Musa alayhi salam was brought up in that place. He was well aware of the politics, the attitudes actually of people, and how to engage with them. Similarly with the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, who spent the first 40 years in Makkah within the people, in fact, to establish their credibility. This was important, that the people knew that these are people who have not come out of the blue, but these are people who have stayed in our community. We have witnessed their akhlaq and their actual morals, which is very important today, especially because sometimes when we look at scholars, mega scholars actually, who live on the other side of the world, perhaps we are more attracted to them, perhaps rightfully so, but we look over our local imam who's lived in the community for 30 years. And the local imam is important because I think he's lived in the community. We know him, we know his akhlaq, how trustworthy he is. Whereas some of the scholars who are abroad, and we have seen this in some of the recent unfortunate incidents that actually have happened, that if you're just engaged with on social media, you actually do not understand how the scholars are, how their akhlaq, until you actually spend time with them. So the prophets themselves really engaged with the community even actually before their prophethood and their announcement of their prophecy. Musa alayhi salam obviously has to leave Egypt because of an incident. And then he goes, وَلَمَّا تَوَجَّهَ تِلْقَاءَ مَدْيَنَ. then he faces towards Madian. And on the way there, he's absolutely, I mean, it's interesting from palace life to absolutely kind of nothing. He does a very famous dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the dua of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam is قَالَ عَسَى رَبِّي أَن يَهْدِيَنِي سَوَاءَ السَّبِيلِ. Perhaps my Lord, inshallah, will have put me towards the straight path, or give me guidance, or make it easier actually for me. And then we are told these two sisters who are coming, and Musa alayhi salam actually helps them fetch some water. And فَجَاءَتْ إِحْدَاهُمَا تَمْشِي عَلَى اسْتِحْيَاءً. So when they go to their father and tell him about the situation, and there was this young man who helped us, one of them comes back and says, my father has called you for an invite. And the Quran interestingly says is فَجَاءَتْ إِحْدَاهُمَا تَمْشِي عَلَى اسْتِحْيَاءٍ. The Quran specifically explains the way she walked. This is a hal, tamshi ala istihya, showing that, in fact, for us, interestingly, actually showing that even when you're engaging with the other gender, it has to be done with istihya, with this form of haya. And I personally actually feel, I mean, I think many people would disagree. I personally feel there has to be, we are living in a community where interaction is constantly taking place. However, in our religious institutions, there's this kind of false sense of segregation that takes place. And obviously, we understand why it happens. There's the fiqhi position to all of this. But I think one of the issues that I have seen with a lot of young people is that a lot of young people feel more comfortable conversing with non-Muslim women rather than Muslim women, simply because the adab has never kind of been taught to them and how to do that because of this kind of segregation. But the Quran interestingly says that this woman, we're actually told in 1-2 narrations is Safura, her name, she comes to Musa alayhi salam, but ala istihya, and it's not to gossip or to engage in idle kind of talk, but it's, with haya. قالت إن أبي يدعوك ليجزيك أجر ما سقيت لنا. My father really wants to repay a favor, but really it's wants to gauge with Musa alayhi salam if he's interested. Now, another interesting point is that the father, who we're told is Sayyidina Shuaib alayhi salam, he doesn't disclose which one of the sisters wants to get married. And this is interesting. All he actually says is, "An unkihaka ihdabna tayya hataini ala an ta'jurani thamani hijaj." I want to propose one of my two daughters to you. And the aim was that, I mean, the scholars write, the reason was that if Musa alayhi salam, for instance, had said no and rejected the proposal, it wouldn't hurt the particular sister if she was actually named. So something for parents actually to think about. Musa alayhi salam then gets married and spends around 10 years there. And then on the way back to Egypt, we are told that Musa alayhi salam encounters this fire. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him the duty of calling Pharaoh back to the true deen. Again, it's some of what scholars have mentioned about the lives of the prophets. Of course, in the hadith it comes that they are the most tested of all people, is important, but their lives haven't been an easy ride. And this is something that we as Muslims perhaps think that, it's education, job, marriage, live happily ever after. And life is really actually not like that. And the Quran says that, which is why then when we are tested, it's like, oh my God, we are tested because we weren't actually expecting that. Life is full of tests. And we see this in the life, particularly of Hazrat Musa alayhi salam, extremely kind of difficult test that he actually has to go through. And even in facing Pharaoh, Pharaoh is, although he is displayed now in the Egyptian Museum, and many of you would have seen now this kind of ridiculous welcoming of the Pharaoh in the recent weeks when the Egyptian government decided to move him, and there was this huge parade, and you know, it just felt very uncomfortable as someone who's kind of, um, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about Pharaoh and kind of degrades him, and he is an epitome of the shaitan. And here we have people on the streets taking photos and, kind of seeing this huge entourage actually moving. But he's there, he's lying down, and he is not very tall. And, when I got to actually see him, and you think, wow, you actually called yourself God. It's very kind of interesting why he actually said that. And the Quran talks about some of his silliness, actually. So one of the verses, and I'll probably end with this, is that وَقَالَ فِرْعَوْنُ يَا أَيُّهَا الْمَلَأُ مَا عَلِمْتُمْ لَكُم مِّنْ إِلَٰهٍ غَيْرِي فَأَوْقِدْ لِي يَا هَامَانُ عَلَى الطِّينِ فَاجْعَل لِّي صَرْحًا لَعَلِّي أَطَّلِعُ إِلَىٰ إِلَٰهِ مُوسَى. He says, I don't know any other God apart from myself. And the Quran talks about Haman, who was his kind of general. So he says to his general, why don't you kind of build me a huge tower so I can ascend up and speak to the Lord of Musa? وَاسْتَكْبَرَ وَهُوَ وَجُنُودَهُ. And the Quran kind of talks about his end, actually, and how he dies. So Surah Al-Qasas, personally, I find it interesting. And I think one of the interesting aspects of Islam is that we have some of these beautiful prophets, which then allows people from those faiths actually to come into Islam, but actually to still have somewhat of their faith. Especially a lot of Jewish converts who because of kind of the rigid nature of Judaism, who have converted, some of them have actually chose Islam because Musa alayhi salam was so central to their life, and they want to move into a religion which respects Musa alayhi salam and honors him. And this is something that I saw through a lot of Jewish and Christian reverts to Islam. Again, with a lot of Christians, Jesus was very integral to their life. So they wanted to move into a faith which preserves that aspect of Jesus and, him being a prophet and actually that respect. And actually Islam allows that. And one of the great kind of Jewish converts was Muhammad Asad, a very interesting figure who later translated the Quran and whose documentary actually can be watched about that. He's a fascinating, actually, figure. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to deal with our challenges. But whenever dealing with them, we always do dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Musa alayhi salam is someone who actually does this. When he's out of Egypt, he does dua. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows him and tells him that it's time to face Firaun, he does actually the same dua. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. That Ya Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just give me the strength, open my chest, allow me to actually face my challenges. A very important actual dua. So inshallah we follow in the footsteps of these ulul azm, great prophets. We take inspirations from their life, and then we use this inspiration perhaps in the last 10 days of Laylatul Qadr to come close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We do dua for the ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wherever they are, that Allah has mercy upon them. Jazakumullah khairun. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.